In the summer of 1903, in the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a baptism ceremony will become the most terrifying event in local history. What should have been a sacred moment of spiritual rebirth transformed into something so disturbing that witnesses would carry the memory to their graves. This is a true story of Samuel Whitmore, a 19-year-old man who descended into the waters of the Serpentine River as one person and emerged as something entirely different. The events that unfolded that day not only changed Samuel's life forever, but cursed generations of families in Millbrook. Church records from 1903, recently discovered in the basement of the old Presbyterian church, reveal a horror so profound that it was deliberately hidden from the world for over a century. Today, we uncover the truth about what really happened when sacred waters became a gateway to ancient evil. This is not just a story about faith gone wrong. This is a warning about forces that should never be awakened, about rituals that can open doors to realms we were never meant to explore. Prepare yourself for a journey into the darkest corners of religious history, where salvation and damnation dance on a razor's edge. Millbrook in 1903 was a town of 800 souls, nestled in the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania. The Serpentine River wound through its heart like a dark ribbon, its waters running deeper and colder than any other waterway in the region. Local Native American tribes had long avoided this particular stretch of river, calling it the place where spirits drink, though the white settlers who founded Millbrook dismissed such warnings as primitive superstition. Samuel Whitmore had lived his entire life in this town. Born to devout Presbyterian parents, he worked at the local mill and was known for his gentle nature and quick smile. His mother, Martha, had been praying for years that her son would finally accept baptism and fully embrace the faith that sustained their family through hardship and loss. The Presbyterian church sat on a hill overlooking the Serpentine River, its white wooden spire pointing toward heaven like an accusing finger. Reverend Ezekiel Blackwood had served this congregation for 15 years, performing countless baptisms in the river's allegedly purifying waters. He was a stern man with penetrating gray eyes and hands that seemed perpetually cold, even in summer. But in the weeks leading up to Samuel's baptism, strange things began happening in Millbrook. Livestock near the river would be found dead with no apparent cause, their eyes clouded white and their bodies drained of blood. Children reported hearing whispers coming from the water at night, speaking in languages that sounded older than time itself. Several townspeople claimed to see dark shapes moving beneath the river's surface, too large and too deliberate to be fish. Martha Whitmore dismissed these reports as hysteria, but Samuel felt differently. He had begun experiencing vivid dreams where he stood at the river's edge, watching something vast and hungry circling in the depths below. In these dreams, voices called his name from beneath the water, promising him knowledge and power beyond human understanding. He would wake covered in cold sweat, with the taste of river water in his mouth. The night before his scheduled baptism, Samuel walked alone to the riverbank. The moon was full, casting silver light across the dark waters. As he knelt to pray, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. The river was completely still, not a single ripple disturbing its surface. But beneath that stillness, he could see shadows moving in patterns too complex and purposeful to be natural. They seemed to be arranging themselves, preparing for something. When he returned home that night, Samuel's mother found him standing in the kitchen, staring out the window toward the river. His eyes, usually warm brown, had taken on a strange, distant quality. When she asked if he was having second thoughts about the baptism, Samuel turned to her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and said, "Mother, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Tomorrow, everything changes." The morning of August 15th dawned gray and humid, with thick clouds hanging low over Millbrook like a burial shroud. Despite the weather, nearly the entire congregation gathered at the river's edge to witness Samuel's baptism. The women wore their finest dresses, and the men had donned their Sunday suits. But there was an undercurrent of unease that even the most faithful couldn't ignore. Reverend Blackwood stood waist-deep in the Serpentine River, his black robes floating around him like the wings of some great aquatic bird. The water was unusually dark that morning, so murky that his legs disappeared completely beneath the surface. Samuel approached the water's edge dressed in simple white clothing, as was customary for baptisms. As Samuel waded into the river, several witnesses later reported that the temperature around them dropped noticeably. Martha Whitmore clutched her shawl tighter and whispered a prayer under her breath. The water seemed to part unnaturally around Samuel's legs, creating small whirlpools that shouldn't have been possible in such slow-moving water. Reverend Blackwood raised his arms and began the traditional invocation. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God to witness the baptism of Samuel Whitmore by water and the Holy Spirit. He will be cleansed of sin and born again into eternal life. But as he spoke these words, his voice seemed to echo strangely, as if the river itself was amplifying and distorting the sound. Samuel moved deeper into the water until he stood beside the reverend. The congregation on the riverbank noticed that fish had begun surfacing around them, floating belly up in ever-widening circles. Some of the women gasped and pointed, but Reverend Blackwood seemed not to notice, his eyes fixed on Samuel with an intensity that bordered on fanatical. Samuel Whitmore, the reverend intoned, "Do you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior?" Samuel nodded, but witnesses swear that in that moment, his voice seemed to come from multiple directions at once when he replied, "I accept what calls to me from the depths." The reverend placed one hand on Samuel's back and the other on his chest, preparing to immerse him. "I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." He pushed Samuel backward into the water, but instead of the quick immersion typical of such ceremonies, Samuel disappeared completely beneath the surface. What happened next defied all natural explanation. Samuel didn't resurface after the usual few seconds. He remained completely submerged for over 10 minutes while the congregation watched in growing horror. Reverend Blackwood stood frozen in the water, his hands still extended in the position where Samuel had been, his face pale with terror. Several men from the congregation waded into the river to search for Samuel, but they found nothing. The water had become so dark and cold that they couldn't see more than inches below the surface. Some reported feeling something brush against their legs, something large and serpentine that seemed to coil around them before sliding away into the depths. Then, just as the townspeople were preparing to accept that Samuel had drowned, the water began to churn violently. Bubbles rose from the depths, bringing with them a smell like sulfur and decay. The surface of the river started to glow with a faint, sickly green phosphorescence that pulsed like a heartbeat. Finally, Samuel erupted from the water with such force that he seemed to be pushed upward by invisible hands. But the young man who emerged was not the same person who had entered the river. His eyes, once warm brown, now gleamed with otherworldly silver light. His skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, and when he smiled at the terrified congregation, they could see that his teeth had become sharp and pointed. Most disturbing of all, when Samuel spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate not just in the air but in the very bones of those who heard him. "I have been reborn," he said, and the words seemed to come from the river itself. "I have seen what waits beneath, and it is beautiful beyond description. What do you think about what you've witnessed so far? Could this have been a genuine supernatural event? Or was there another explanation for Samuel's transformation? Have you ever experienced something during a religious ceremony that you couldn't explain? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Samuel's return to normal life in Millbrook was anything but normal. Within days of his baptism, it became clear that whatever had happened in the Serpentine River had fundamentally altered him in ways that defied rational explanation. His family was the first to notice the changes, and they were the first to fear what their son had become. Martha Whitmore found Samuel standing in the kitchen at 3 a.m, perfectly still, staring out the window toward the river. When she asked what he was doing, he turned to her with those strange silver eyes and said, "Listening to the voices, Mother. They have so much to teach me." She noticed that his footprints on the wooden floor seemed to steam slightly, as if his feet were burning hot despite his flesh feeling cold to the touch. But the physical changes were only the beginning. Samuel began demonstrating knowledge. he couldn't possibly possess. He would greet neighbors by name before being introduced. And more disturbing still, he would mention details about their private lives that no one else knew. When old Mr. Henderson from the dry goods store tried to test him, Samuel looked him directly in the eyes and said, "The money you've been stealing from the church collection plate is hidden beneath the loose floorboard in your bedroom. $23.47, to be exact." Henderson's face went white, and he never spoke to Samuel again. Even more unsettling were Samuel's predictions. He began casually mentioning future events with chilling accuracy. He told Mrs. Patterson that her husband would break his leg falling from their barn roof 2 days before it happened. He warned the blacksmith that his horse would go lame, specifying the exact day and even the specific leg that would be injured. Every prediction came true with terrifying precision. The town doctor, a rational man named Cornelius Webb, attempted to examine Samuel at his mother's request. What he found defied medical explanation. Samuel's body temperature fluctuated wildly, sometimes dropping so low that frost would form on his skin, other times spiking so high that touching him was like touching a furnace. His pulse was irregular, sometimes racing at an impossible 300 beats per minute, other times so slow it seemed his heart had stopped entirely. Most disturbing was what Dr. Webb observed when he looked into Samuel's eyes with his magnifying lens. Instead of the normal blood vessels, he saw what appeared to be tiny, writhing forms moving beneath the surface of Samuel's irises. When he mentioned this observation, Samuel smiled and whispered, "They're not moving beneath my eyes, doctor. They're moving beneath yours." That night, Dr. Webb was found in his study, staring into his magnifying lens with such intensity that his wife couldn't break his concentration. When she finally managed to pull the lens away, she discovered that his eyes had been permanently damaged, as if he had been staring directly into the sun for hours. The changes in Samuel weren't limited to his physical form or supernatural knowledge. His very presence began to affect the environment around him. Plants would wither when he walked past them. The milk in the Whitmore family's cow went sour every morning, despite the animal being perfectly healthy. Most tellingly, every Bible in the Whitmore household developed strange water stains that appeared overnight, and the pages containing passages about baptism and spiritual rebirth would often be found torn out by morning. Samuel's appetite also changed dramatically. He stopped eating regular food entirely, instead consuming only things that had been touched by river water. He would collect rainwater in bowls and drink it exclusively. When his mother tried to force him to eat bread or meat, he would become violently ill, vomiting a dark substance that smelled like stagnant pond water. The most terrifying change occurred 3 weeks after the baptism. Samuel began sleepwalking, but his nighttime wanderings followed a pattern that chilled his family to the bone. Every night, he would leave his bed and walk to the Serpentine River, where neighbors reported seeing him standing motionless in the shallows until dawn. They said he appeared to be having conversations with something beneath the water, nodding and gesturing as if responding to an invisible companion. When his father tried to follow him one night, he discovered something that made him question his own sanity. Samuel's footprints, clearly visible in the soft mud leading to the river, simply stopped at the water's edge. But the sound of conversation continued, and occasionally his father could swear he heard 2 distinct voices, both sounding like Samuel but speaking simultaneously in different languages. The breaking point came when Samuel approached Reverend Blackwood after Sunday service. In front of the entire congregation, he placed his hand on the Reverend's shoulder and said in that eerily harmonious voice, "Thank you for opening the door, Reverend. The Ancient Ones are so grateful for your service. They've been waiting so very long for someone to break the barriers between worlds." Reverend Blackwood's response was immediate and visceral. He began screaming uncontrollably and clawing at his own clothes, shouting that something was crawling beneath his skin. He had to be physically restrained and was found the next morning in his study, having torn every page from his Bible and arranged them in complex patterns across the floor. In the center of these paper spirals, he had drawn symbols in his own blood that matched no known religious or occult tradition. We want to take a moment to thank you for staying with this story until this point. We truly appreciate your time and dedication to uncovering this terrifying truth. We assure you that the most shocking revelations are yet to come, and what you'll discover in the remaining chapters will change everything you thought you knew about this case. The truth about what had really occurred during Samuel's baptism began to emerge when the town's librarian, Eleanor Marsh, discovered a collection of documents hidden behind a false wall in the church's basement. These papers, some dating back to the 1600s, revealed that the Serpentine River had been the site of ancient rituals long before European settlers arrived in Pennsylvania. The documents included testimonies from early colonists who had witnessed Native American ceremonies along the riverbank. These accounts described rituals designed not to honor spirits, but to keep something imprisoned beneath the water. The indigenous peoples had recognized the river as a thin place between worlds, where malevolent entities from another realm pressed against the barriers of reality, constantly seeking a way to break through. According to tribal legends preserved in these papers, something vast and hungry had been trapped beneath the Serpentine River for centuries. The native shamans had performed regular binding ceremonies to strengthen the supernatural locks that held this entity in place. But when the European settlers arrived and the native population was displaced, these protective rituals ceased. The barriers had been weakening for over 200 years. The documents revealed that Reverend Blackwood had not been the first religious leader to attempt baptisms in the Serpentine River. 3 previous ministers had performed the ritual, and each time, the person being baptized had undergone a similar transformation. These earlier cases have been covered up, the transformed individuals quietly relocated or, in some cases, killed by terrified townspeople who believed they were dealing with demonic possession. But Samuel's case was different. The entity beneath the river had grown stronger with each breach of the barriers. This time, it hadn't simply possessed a human host. It had begun to merge with our reality entirely, using Samuel as an anchor point to manifest its presence in the physical world. Eleanor Marsh's investigation also uncovered newspaper clippings from neighboring towns reporting strange disappearances that coincided with Samuel's transformation. People would vanish while walking near rivers, lakes, or even wells. Search parties would find their belongings at the water's edge, but the people themselves were never seen again. The only common factor was that witnesses reported seeing someone matching Samuel's description in the area shortly before each disappearance. The most chilling discovery came in the form of a journal kept by the previous minister, Reverend Jonathan Crane, who had served the church 30 years earlier. His final entry, written in increasingly erratic handwriting, described his growing awareness of what lurked beneath the Serpentine River. It spoke to me through the waters of baptism, not with words, but with visions that burned themselves into my mind. I saw the world as it existed before human civilization, when entities of impossible geometry and alien hunger ruled the earth. This thing beneath our river is one of them. A survivor from that ancient time, waiting with infinite patience for the opportunity to reclaim what it believes is rightfully its domain. Each baptism weakens the barriers. Each soul touched by its influence becomes a stepping stone back to power. God forgive me, I have been its unwitting servant for years. Reverend Crane had disappeared shortly after writing that entry, his body never found. But the journal continued for several more pages in handwriting that was unmistakably his, despite him being presumed dead. These post-mortem entries described the river entity's true nature and its ultimate goals. It wasn't simply malevolent. It was completely alien to human existence, viewing our reality as something to be consumed and transformed into an extension of its own nightmare realm. As Eleanor Marsh read these revelations, she began to understand the scope of the horror that had been unleashed. Samuel wasn't just possessed or transformed. He was becoming a living portal through which this ancient entity could reshape reality itself. Every person who disappeared near water wasn't just murdered. They were being fed to something that existed partially outside of our dimensional space, growing stronger with each consumed soul. The journal's final entry, written in Reverend Crane's hand but describing events that occurred after his death, contained a prophecy that made Eleanor's blood run cold. When a vessel is complete, when the anchor soul has been fully consumed, The great submersion will begin. All water will become its domain. All rivers will flow with its essence. The earth will remember what it was like when the ancient ones ruled, and humanity will learn what it truly means to be prey. Eleanor realized with growing horror that this prophecy was already beginning to come true. Reports were flooding in from across the state of rivers and lakes taking on the same dark, phosphorescent quality as the Serpentine River. Fish were dying in massive numbers. People living near water sources were reporting the same whispers and visions that had plagued Millbrook before Samuel's baptism. The entity wasn't just using Samuel as a host. It was using him as a seed, spreading its influence through the interconnected waterways that spanned the entire continent. What had begun as a single cursed baptism was becoming a continental catastrophe that threatened to transform the very nature of reality itself. Armed with the knowledge she had uncovered, Eleanor Marsh knew she had to confront Samuel directly, but she also understood that she might be walking toward her own death. The young man who had once been known for his gentle nature had become something far more dangerous than anyone in Millbrook fully comprehended. She found him, as she expected, standing at the edge of the Serpentine River in the pre-dawn darkness. The water around his feet glowed with that sickly phosphorescence, and shapes moved beneath the surface in patterns that hurt to look at directly. When he turned to face her, his silver eyes reflected the starlight with an intensity that seemed to pierce through her soul. "Eleanor Marsh," Samuel said, though she had approached silently, and he had not turned around when she arrived. "The librarian who thinks knowledge can save her. You've been reading the old documents, haven't you? You've learned about what I really am." Eleanor steeled herself and stepped closer, clutching a leather bag containing items she had gathered based on her research. "I know that you're not Samuel Whitmore anymore. I know what's been done to you, and I know what's being done through you." Samuel laughed, but the sound came from multiple directions at once, as if the river itself was joining in his amusement. "Done to me? Eleanor, you still don't understand. Nothing was done to me. I chose this. When I felt the presence beneath these waters, when I heard its call, I went willingly. Samuel Whitmore was weak, limited, mortal. I transcended those boundaries. The documents say there's a way to reverse it," Eleanor said, though her voice shook with uncertainty. "The native tribes had rituals, ways to strengthen the barriers." "The barriers?" Samuel interrupted. "Eleanor, there are no barriers anymore. They crumbled the moment I accepted the gift that was offered to me. What you call an entity, what your precious documents call monster, is actually a liberator. It's freeing this world from the prison of linear time and limited dimension." As Samuel spoke, the water began to rise around them, though no rain was falling and no dam had burst. The Serpentine River was swelling with liquid that seemed thicker than water, darker than shadow. Eleanor realized with growing terror that the substance rising around them wasn't entirely water at all. It was something else, something that had been using water as a disguise for centuries. "The baptism didn't change me," Samuel continued, his voice now echoing from beneath the rising liquid, as well as from his physical form. "It revealed me. Every human being carries a potential for transcendence, but most are too afraid to embrace it. The entity beneath this river doesn't destroy, it transforms. It offers evolution." Eleanor reached into her bag and pulled out a collection of items her research had suggested might have protective properties. Salt from the ocean, silver blessed by a priest, and symbols copied from the native tribal documents. But when she began to arrange them in the pattern described in Reverend Crane's journal, Samuel simply smiled. "You're trying to use their old magic," he observed. "But you don't understand what you're fighting. This isn't about good versus evil, Eleanor. This is about limited versus unlimited, finite versus infinite. The thing you're trying to banish isn't separate from nature. It is nature in its truest, most ancient form." The liquid continued to rise, now reaching Eleanor's waist. She felt things moving against her legs beneath the surface, things with too many joints and geometries that violated the normal rules of anatomy. Her protective symbols were dissolving in the strange water, their power neutralized by whatever force was emanating from Samuel. "I was never dragged beneath the river," Samuel revealed, his form beginning to waver like a reflection into stirred water. "I dove willingly. I sought out what others feared. And what I found was the truth that religions and myths have been hiding for millennia, that consciousness is not limited to the forms we think we understand." As Eleanor struggled against the rising liquid, she realized a horrible truth of Samuel's words. The entity hadn't possessed him or transformed him against his will. It had offered him a choice, and he had chosen to abandon his humanity entirely. The baptism hadn't been a mistake or an accident. It had been a deliberate invitation extended to something that had been waiting centuries for a willing host. But why? Eleanor gasped as the liquid reached her chest. Why would you choose to become this? Samuel's physical form began to dissolve into the strange water surrounding them, but his voice remained clear and present. "Because I saw what lies beyond death, beyond time, beyond the narrow constraints of human existence. I saw eternity, Eleanor, and it was beautiful beyond description. Every person who disappears into these waters doesn't die. They transcend. They become part of something vast and magnificent." Eleanor's final coherent thought, as the liquid closed over her head, was the realization that Samuel was right about one thing. She could see beyond death now, but what she saw wasn't beautiful. It was hungry, ancient, and utterly alien to everything that made life meaningful. She understood, too late, that some forms of transcendence were indistinguishable from damnation. The next morning, Eleanor Marsh was found standing at the edge of the Serpentine River, staring into its depths with the same silver eyes that had marked Samuel's transformation. When concerned townspeople approached her, she turned to them with a smile that was both familiar and terrifyingly foreign. "I understand now," she said in that eerily harmonious voice that seemed to resonate from multiple sources. "We've all been so afraid of what we didn't understand. But there's nothing to fear in transformation. There's only beauty in becoming something more than we ever imagined possible." By winter of 1903, half the population of Millbrook had developed those same silver eyes. By spring of 1904, the town was abandoned, its remaining residents having either fled or joined the growing number of transformed individuals who spent their days and nights at the river's edge, welcoming whatever emerged from its depths. The Serpentine River still flows through Pennsylvania today, though few people know its true name or its history. Maps from after 1904 simply label it as unnamed tributary, and local authorities have made sure that information about Millbrook's fate remains buried in forgotten archives. But sometimes, travelers passing through the area report seeing figures standing in the shallows of certain rivers, their eyes reflecting light in ways that human eyes shouldn't. They report hearing voices calling from beneath the water, voices that speak in perfect harmony about the beauty of transformation and the joy of transcending human limitations. These reports are always dismissed as folklore or the products of overactive imaginations. After all, what happened in Millbrook in 1903 was just a story, wasn't it? The baptism of Samuel Whitmore teaches us that some doorways should never be open, and some invitations should never be accepted. It reminds us that the line between salvation and damnation can be thinner than we ever imagined, and that sometimes the greatest horrors come not from external forces, but from our own willingness to abandon what makes us human. What do you think about this story? Do you believe that certain religious rituals could actually open gateways to otherworldly forces? Have you ever experienced something during a ceremony or spiritual practice that you couldn't explain? Have you ever felt called to something that others warned you away from? Share your thoughts and your own supernatural experiences in the comments below. If this story gave you chills and made you question the nature of spiritual transformation, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you the most terrifying true stories from history, the ones that official records try to bury and that survivors were afraid to tell. And don't miss our next video. Subscribe to the channel and enter the placelet and follow other stories so intriguing and frightening like this. Click on the screen to watch it now.